Let me, before I introduce the speaker today, I want to situate this talk uh, in the landscape of how we have progressed over the symposium in the last 7 or 8 talks. We started with a large, a big picture historical overview from Carrie King, and then since then we have looked at different aspects of national policy and even two important issues at the state level in Texas, wind in Texas and deregulation in Texas. So we have more or less been focused on the national landscape. The next three talks, we are going outside. We are taking an international tilt here a little bit for the next three talks. And what I've asked Gevorg to do is lay out the landscape for us, the energy landscape from a global perspective. So obviously the overarching theme here is for today's talk is climate change, but then we'll also see what all the different, how all the different energy technologies and resources fit into this picture, but also what the big different countries that are important and countries that might be affected for this. So how does one put all that together and think about these issues? Our next speaker is Armand Cohen, who is the executive director of the Clean Air Task Force. It's a very, very important and very active organization. The title of his talk is Solving the Climate Problem at Scale, an Environmentalist Perspective. So we had a chance to hear from Commissioner Porter, who had a certain view, and now at the other extreme, we'll have a chance to hear from an environmentalist. It should be interesting. He's a great guy. He's just so plugged into all that is happening. Please join us. So with that, let me introduce our speaker today, Gevorg Sargsyan. Gevorg has been at the World Bank for 11 years. Really, the breadth of his experience and the depth, obviously, is just mind-boggling. So he has worked and advised governments, and at the very top level in countries in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, South Asia, and more recently, he has done some very landmark work in the Indian context and the Russian context. So two of his recent major publications are Unleashing the Potential of Renewable Energy in India. It's a big hit, I can tell you. If you just Google something in India renewable energy, that's one of the top papers. And then Energy Efficiency in Russia, Untapped Reserves. Since 2010, and that's why we actually got him here today, Gevorg is in charge of the Clean Investment Fund, or the Clean Technology Fund, and also in charge of scaling up renewable energy program at the World Bank. And through these two efforts, he manages over $2 billion in funds. So if you have some good ideas, this is the guy with the checkbook. Catch him. Gevorg has a MS in Applied Mathematics from Yerevan University, and he did his postgraduate studies in financial economics from the Armenian National Academy of Science, and he also has research experience at UC Berkeley. The title of his talk is there, International Climate Finance, Past, Present, and Future. It's going to be terrific. Please join me in welcoming Gevorg.
Oh, thank you very much, Varun, for this introduction. I was also impressed by it. It's actually a great pleasure to be here today in this lovely city and in famous university. I've been here only 24 hours. I have already fell in love with this place. So it's great. So as Varun said, we're going to talk today about climate finance and inevitably about climate change. So you have learned a little bit about me. So before I start the presentation, I'm going actually to ask you a few questions. So I'd like to get to know you a little bit better. So my first question, raise your hands if either you are studying climate change, energy, or related fields, either or taking classes or teaching for that matter. Wow, that's some, I cannot BS here, huh? Okay, that's good. Okay, then raise your hands if you have seen a documentary by Al Gore, Inconvenient Truth. That's good. Most of you have done it. So then raise your hand if you believe that the climate change is the result of direct result of human activity, and you think that in this century there is a good chance that we might experience some of the catastrophes you have learned about in this film, or maybe in Day After Tomorrow movie, for example. 70% or so, maybe more. Good. Okay, then the last question.
Your last question had two things together.
Yeah, that was a trick. This one is going to be more. Yeah, I knew it was going to be tough. Okay, the last one is, what is the consensus among scientists about the temperature increase that will allow us to stay in safe limits without having any material impact on the planet and on the climate? So there are three options: 2 degrees, 3 degrees, and 4 degrees. So I'm going to say 2, 3, 4, and you raise your hands. 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees. Okay, no, I actually tricked you here. It's actually 0. So that was an inaccurate question here. But anyway, in reality, unfortunately, it's not. The material impact has already started. I personally believe that the climate change, along with the unsustainable exploitation of the environment, is the biggest threat that human civilization is facing. And it's a result of the largest market failure. So this is for economists. And basically, our mere survival is at risk. Nicholas Stern, who is one of the well-known economists in the climate change, and he has shaped European thinking in this area, he believes that the damages and disasters of climate change might be well above what has been caused by 2 world wars in the last century. Now, climate finance is basically an insurance. Insurance to buy to minimize these damages where possible, and where some of these damages are inevitable, it is to make us more resilient to the climate change. And the technologies are there and they are available. The cost is significant, but it is affordable. So the question is whether the current generation is willing to sacrifice a fraction of their wealth to benefit many more generations to come. And as you will see from this presentation, the answer is, we don't know yet. So I'll talk a little bit about the science of the climate change and the impact of the climate change, and you all seem to be quite aware of this, but just to make sure that we are all on the same page. And we'll move then into solutions that are probably out there and the ways we can go forward. We'll talk about cost, then are there money for this today, and what is the future of climate financing there? Okay, so what are the impacts of climate change? You might have seen some of this. The fact is that climate change is reality. It's happening. It has been happening for the last 100 years. There are clear evidences, either in terms of increase of global temperature or average sea level or a reduction of the snow cover. What was debated is whether or not human activity directly caused this. So in 1990, when the IPCC, which stands for Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, started debating this, it basically consists of scientists from all over the world. They kind of could not conclude it. So in 20 years, what has happened is that there is basically, I think, unequivocal evidence that this is caused by human activities, despite of the fact that I believe 70% of Americans don't believe into this. I don't know whether the number is correct. Also, this IPCC is probably the lowest common denominator because it's very politicized And you have scientists from all countries. Many of them are heavily influenced by the local politics. So this is really common denominator. So if they have agreed, it means that this is really quite reliable. Again, some of the other evidences is most of the glaciers have retreated so far. You can see the disturbing pictures of, I think these are satellite images of Greenland, where basically the permanent snow cover has been retreating significantly over the last 15 to 20 years. And also the temperature has already gone up, as I mentioned earlier, by about 1 degree centigrade. And we know that the greenhouse gases are the main cause of this. So in the last 20 years, we have managed to double the gases that we emit into the atmosphere. And the energy sector in particular has been in front of this emission. It also contributes the largest share. I mean, it shows here 6%. In reality is much higher because you have energy pretty much everywhere. Industry is energy, residential is energy, agriculture is energy, transport has a lot of energy. So energy is really key to this. So if things continue as business as usual scenario, then we'll likely end up with over 5 degrees increase by the end of this century. So the 2 degrees that many of you have heard is probably not the economic optimum where there has been consensus around, but it's something that most scientists believe is responsible things to do, and it's so far feasible thing to do. So this is where the 2 degrees come from. There have been a lot of commitments by various governments across the board to reduce emissions. And we'll talk a little bit about this later in this presentation. But even if all this is implemented, we still will not be able to maintain it within 2 degrees and will be well above 3 degrees. Again, if all this is implemented. Now, who has been hit hardly? This is the poor people and poor countries. Developing countries are going to face most of the consequences of the climate change, while the problem has been by and large caused by the industrialized world developed countries. About 2/3 of the emissions that has been so far concentrated in the atmosphere has come from the developed world. And if you look at the per capita emissions, you can see that even countries like China per capita emit only a tiny fraction of what developed countries emit. And Qatar is not here. If Qatar was here, we would have been probably somewhere here. Yeah, but the next one is Australia. I think it's pretty high there. And so the map there actually shows vulnerability of countries. So the darker the color, the more vulnerable they are. And it talks about financial vulnerability. This is an ongoing exercise yet, but basically what it means that these countries might have disasters in this period of years that they will not be able to cope with financially. And just to give you an example, I think it was a couple of years ago, the Hurricane Ivan, I believe, it hit the island Grenada, and so the damages that have been caused were estimated about 200% of their GDP. So this is the cost that they paid. And so this was not something that they could sustain. Obviously, a lot of international aid went there to help. Okay, so now what happens if we go to 5 degrees? Well, again, I mean, 2 degrees still is going to create a lot of problems. Sea level is going to raise. More people are going to be hungry. Land is going to be lost. But it's something that we can cope with. Financially, economically, we think that the international community, scientists, politicians, they think that they can cope with this. So 5 degree is something that might not be just sustainable, and we might not be able to handle this. Actually, 5 degrees in 1 century And then compare it with 5 degrees increase since the last ice age. This is what happened when some of these glaciers were in New England and maybe in Washington State. So this is that was the ice age. And since then, the climate has gone up, the temperature has gone up by 5 degrees. So in only 100 years, we might raise the temperature by the same 5 degrees. The problem is that the ecosystem and societies might not be able to cope with these changes in such a short period of time. And just to give you a flavor what is going to likely happen, I don't know, it's like a sci-fi movie or a horror movie, but so it's going to be a lot of drought, and a lot of land is going to turn into desert around the world. I believe that you have been experiencing a lot of drought here in Texas recently, and unusually high incidence of that. The loss of glaciers in Andes and in Himalayas, and this is going to affect pretty much hundreds of millions of people living in South Asia and in South America, affecting their livelihood, and also indirectly affecting the rest of the world because a lot of food comes from that part. Flooding. This picture I took in Maldives, which is supposed to be just, sun and, palm trees and beaches, and this was their high season, dry season. It was heavily flooded, as you can see, and was quite disturbing and quite unusual. There is a good chance that more than 50% of species might be extincted as a result of 5 degrees. Loss of assets because of rising sea level. Ocean acidification leading to basically collapse of the marine ecosystem, loss of corals pretty much everywhere in Caribbean or in the Pacific or in the Indian Oceans. Again, about 600 million people are going to lose their homes and lands because of the rising sea level. And so these people will need to find places to live, and they will likely start migrating. Many of them live in countries like Bangladesh, Vietnam, etc. But even Manhattan will likely be underwater unless significant engineering is done to protect the city and the area. And we may lose Amazon rainforest and also some of the northern forests in Russia and in Canada. And some of this is considered actually the lung of the planet. So it's not clear what will happen if these start turning into savannas. And then also if you go to the northern part, if this whole thing starts really warming up, then all the climate change might be amplified by the release of methane from the permafrost and from tundra in Russia, in Canada, in Alaska. And then, in reality, we cannot really forecast what will happen if this scenario becomes a reality. Now, the challenge is even more complex because there are about 1.6 billion people in the world that do not have access to basic modern energy services these days. It's electricity or cooking for heating. So these people will need also to get their fair share, which will probably put additional stress on the environment and on emissions. And plus, by 2050, we will have 2 billion more people. The population will grow by another 2 billion. And so more demand for energy, more demand for food, more demand for goods. So we'll have to, it's not a static situation. We'll have to keep with this changing environment. Okay, so what are the solutions there? Well, a two-part solution, right? As I mentioned in the beginning. One is really the mitigation. So how do we really minimize the disasters and the impact that is happening through technologies, to behavioral change, to policies that will lead to significant reduction of greenhouse gas emission into the atmosphere. And it is all over the place. It's the energy sector, probably number one, but the transport, agriculture, forests, it all will have to come together if we really want to find a solution. But the other is adaptation. Adaptation meaning that there will be impact and we'll need to be prepared to this impact. And particularly developing countries will have to be ready to face this because they are going to really, as I mentioned again, be hit hard by this. So there are three fundamental principles that probably are important if we want to succeed. The first one is act now. Why act now? Because there is a good chance if we delay the action by 10 years, then the 2 degrees will likely become unachievable. If we postpone mitigation efforts in developing world by 20 years, then the cost is going to double. And why is that? Because like country like China is going to double their building stock in next 5 years. So in about 10 years, they are going to double. They have already started. And it means that they will build buildings of certain design, and these buildings will be there for another 50 to 100 years. So retrofitting these buildings will be either impossible, it's very expensive. So if we want to fix it, we need to fix it now. In the same way, there are a lot of coal plants are being built around the world, including Texas, but also in developing countries. So these plants are going to emit CO2 in the next 25 years, equal to the entire coal industry emission over the last century. So unless we really think about this, then it might be too late, at least will be too late to achieve the 2 degree limit, or to stay within the 2 degree. The act together, why act together? Because even if one significant player is not part of the game, then the cost for others is going to be substantially higher. To give you an example, if US is not part of the deal, whatever it is, then the total cost, and US emission is 20%, huge, the highest. No, it has been surpassed by China, second highest. But if US is not part of the deal, the increase of cost will be by 60% for everyone else. And then finally, act differently is just a mindset issue. We need to think out of box and we come up with solutions that will be transformational. The business as usual, even in areas of clean energy, etc., will just not help us and will not get us where we want to be. So act differently is absolutely critical. So those are some of the technologies and that will probably help us to take us halfway. Now, you can see on this slide that in few years we will need to peak our emissions, and since then we will have to start declining. And it's about in 8 years. Actual business as usual scenario is probably a bit worse than the one you see there, because this was forecast. What has helped a little bit the financial crisis as kind of irony. It has driven demand down, and so emissions have been a bit less than were expected, but they're still higher than actually the business as usual scenario. So we'll have to really peak the emission in about 10 years, and then we'll have to take it steadily down. So you see some of the technologies, energy efficiency and renewable energy, combined with the carbon storage technology will probably provide about, at least according to forecast, about 70%. And this forecast is up to 2050 because we don't know what will happen after that. We barely know what will happen in the next 20, 30 years. Now, there is probably a lot of skepticism about some of these technologies, particularly one on carbon capture and storage. It basically, I don't know if you're aware of the technology, is taking the carbon that is being emitted and putting it back into the ground where it belongs to. So there are already some commercial there are some demonstration storages around the world, but the economics is still, the cost is really still very high, and we'll have to see where it gets us. But on the other hand, on some of the other aspects like renewable energy, we have been seeing some of the breakthroughs. So this is the scenario. Now, the other one is the behavioral change. So we talked about this 1.6 billion people, right, that still need to be supplied with electricity. So if they are supplied with traditional, conventional electricity, which has a lot of fossil fuel, so the emissions that will be result of supplying them with the basic needs can be easily offset by behavioral change. If everyone in the United States who drives SUVs has switched to European fuel efficiency cars, the emission reduction there would have been sufficient to offset this. This is just one example of this. And I think this is probably an appropriate thing to say in Texas, right? Okay, the cost. Oh, cost, this is really tough. There are considerable uncertainties around the cost. Why? Because, again, we don't know what will be cost of future technologies. We don't know even what will be the future technologies. Maybe we'll be breakthrough with fusion. Well, then we still save it. I don't know. You probably would know better. We also don't know ability of the ecosystems and societies to adapt to changes. We assume that they will not be able to adapt as quickly, I think, but we don't know. We don't know where is the tipping point actually beyond which the catastrophic impact occur and it's reversible. So there's a lot of unknown things. We also are facing the distributional issues across time, right? This generation will have to invest into something that future generations are going to benefit. So there's a lot of conflict around that. And we also do not have clear idea, the economists do not have clear idea on evaluation of some of this. There are a lot of models there, but it's still, there is no consensus on what is this value of loss of life, livelihood, and biodiversity. So this is all challenge. But one thing is clear, that cost of action must be compared with cost of inaction. So that, I think, is a fundamental principle there. And there is also emerging agreement that at around 2 degrees or 2.5 degrees, we are getting the break even. So basically there we are having benefits of exceeding the costs. So this is on that. Many of you probably have seen this chart. This is McKinsey chart. And I think what it basically shows is that there are technologies that can be done today, and if you do it, you save money, but you don't do it. The SUV is part of that. It's an example, right? If we all switch from SUVs to more economic cars, we are going to save money. Everyone is going to benefit, right? Okay, maybe it's different a little bit sort of style and different way of life, but overall, we are going to be fine. I mean, or take the lights. If I think U.S. Department of Energy was trying to pass a regulation that will basically prohibit use of incandescent bulbs in a few years. Have they? Yeah. But there was strong pushback, actually, and it was strong pushback. I mean, it's again, no-brainer. You save money, everyone saves. You say there was very strong pushback, and the main argument was that this is a free country, and we want freedom to waste our money and emit our CO2 if sort of this is what that was the main argument. I mean, I'm probably exaggerating a little bit, but oh no, okay, there you go. Okay, I was trying to be politically correct. And so cost, okay, but there are still a number of models, and so all these models produce results that the cost is going to be between 0.5% to 1.5% of GDP. Basically, we are going to contribute, if we want to keep this temperature increase within the 2-degree level, we are going to contribute about, this, say, 1%. Now, current insurance industry is contributing over 3% of GDP globally. So we are already paying a lot of money for insurance, and it's 3%. So this is about 1%. This is 1% of our income. Probably poor people will pay less, rich will pay more. But this will cost probably higher GDP share for developing world than for developed world. So there are some estimates for developing countries, how much it will require and will cost. The incremental cost will vary probably between $140 and $180 billion for next 20 years that will be required for them for mitigation measures. And with adaptation, there has been even less accurate research done. But some of the estimates, including the World Bank estimates, suggest that it's somewhere between maybe $30 to $100 billion that developing countries will require in next 20 years to adopt. So then what are we getting? Where are we now with the finance? Well, there has been a lot of promises, but not really much actual delivery and money. So in Copenhagen and in Cancun, those are the meetings of COPs, basically the annual meetings where all these climate deals are being discussed. A number of agreements have been reached, actually, after the deal on carbon pricing failed. So the Copenhagen Accord, I think it was President Obama's proposal. And then it was followed by Cancun Agreement. So basically, developed countries promised to deliver fast-track finance of about $30 billion in 3 years. 2 years have already elapsed. And then mobilize $100 billion thereafter by 2020. So basically, every year since 2012, $100 billion. In addition, about 90 countries, as part of the accord, came up with their plans, and they've registered their plans to reduce emissions. More than half of them are developing countries. The problem is that they often talk about reduction of emission intensity and absolute emissions, and it's understandable. For India, for example, they need to grow, and their total emissions will likely to continue to grow. So they are talking about emissions per GDP rather than absolute emissions. So that means that absolute emissions will likely continue to grow. And again, if it's all implemented, there is a big if about this, but let's assume it's all implemented, it will take us only halfway to achieve our ultimate objective. With the current money that are flowing is barely $8 billion for mitigation. Some of it is actually repackaged funds that have been planned for other purposes. So additionality of these funds is a big question. And less than $1 billion has been provided for adaptation. So this is the current situation. And there are a lot of funds out there. And just to mention a few that are specifically dedicated, but I'm not going to discuss them in details. It's a Global Environment Fund, has been there for quite some time. It has about $4 billion. It finances a lot of knowledge and technology transfer, concepts, etc., a lot of technical assistance in developing countries. Carbon finance, which was part of the Kyoto Protocol, has actually delivered quite a bit. There is a lot of criticism, but overall, I think it has been quite successful experience. So some estimates that they will, when they deliver, because this is result-based financing, so we'll see money coming in next 15, 20 years. So it will be probably around 19 billion. So I'm actually in charge of these climate investment funds, which were created a few years ago. This is probably the largest pot of money that exists today, but it's only $6.5 billion there. And there's a lot of other financing, commercial or semi-commercial, by developing institutions, by bilateral donors that are being sort of used for climate, but they are not specifically dedicated to climate finance. So let me skip some of this. If you are interested, you can ask questions on Kyoto Protocol so that we can discuss it. Just very briefly on the fund I'm dealing with. Again, I mentioned this 6.5 billion. It finances both adaptation and mitigation. And as mitigation, it's mainly energy and transport, but it also has forest. So it's a number of sub-funds there. It has about $6.5 billion, but it intends to leverage about $45–50 billion, and it has already delivered quite a bit of that. And it's really about demonstration and about transfer of low carbon technologies. It's also about transformation. Some of the examples of what is being done, it's things like concentrated solar power in Middle East and North Africa, in South Africa, and hopefully soon in India. It's geothermal in Indonesia, Kenya, Ethiopia, wind in Egypt, Morocco, Mexico, access to electricity using clean technologies in Africa, in Nepal, in Maldives, in Mali. Some of it is already underway, some of it is being prepared, but those are the plans that have been discussed and by and large endorsed. Some of the energy efficiency and smart grid technologies, and I mean, developing world is quite ahead now of some of the developed countries in many regards, and then public transport. So those are some of the things that we are now financing, which in many areas are truly transformational. It's still too little, but we hope that we will be able to demonstrate results and we'll be able to actually catalyze more resources in this area. So what is the future of climate finance? Well, one thing is that funds will have to come from all potential sources if we really want to face the challenge. The expectation that rich countries, which are not anymore so rich, are going to provide all the funds from their budgets is probably naive, and it's probably becoming a myth. So it will have to be really creative sort of thinking, and a lot of new instruments will have to be developed in this area. So governments will have to play their role, donors will have to play their role, development institutions will have to play their role, and private sector will have to play their role. And I think it's only by the coordinated effort it will be possible. Yet, there are things that could have been done or still can be done which could raise at least the funds that are required for developing countries. And that kind of no-brainer for those who are economists and maybe scientists was and still remains carbon pricing. And whether it is through cap and trade or it is through taxes, I think economists can debate about which one is really better. I think they ultimately both produce what is required, the most efficient and effective way of achieving the target. Unfortunately, it's not likely to happen anytime soon, but even a modest $25 price on CO2 would have delivered easily $250 billion, and only fraction of it, by channeling only fraction of it to developing countries, we would have been able to actually significantly reduce the financing gap. Well, there are also, the second best to this is probably a fee-based, which is a modification of this, where you basically take same SUVs, right? So you charge SUVs, impose higher taxes, and then you give rebates to efficient cars. So it's just sort of a simpler form of it. It's not as efficient, but it still can produce maybe about $40–50 billion if again, maybe carbon is about $25. There are a lot of wasteful fossil subsidies. I mean, the sort of no-brainer is about $60 billion. This is what we have estimated that can easily be redirected without having any negative impact on societies, people, economies. I believe, as far as I know, the coal plant that is being built not far from here is also heavily subsidized by the government. But I'm talking not only about developed countries, but even more so about developing countries. So we see a lot of this, and this is kind of a no-brainer. And there are some new market-based instruments that are being suggested, such as taxing aviation and maritime fuels. Those industries have been traditionally kind of exempt from most of the taxes due to their nature, right? They do not belong anywhere, so it's difficult to tax them. So and so this is some of the things that can be really done. And if this has been done and only a fraction of this money have been channeled to developing countries, we have been able to finance this 150 billion or so incremental cost is there. But if we really want to achieve long-term transformation, what would be required is the bringing in private sector. It's basically private investment leveraged by the public policy reforms and institutional development, and public outlays will be instrumental for meeting financial goals. This is absolutely critical. I don't think it is necessarily mainstreamed into the thinking of the policymakers around the world. I think I have just a few minutes, and I don't really probably, I will skip this slide. This is about Green Fund. It's one of the agreements that was reached in Cancun to establish Green Climate Fund. This is an ongoing work. If you are interested, I'm happy to answer questions. Where do they stand? In Durban, which is the next meeting, which is going to take place in about a month, beginning of December. The proposal for creation, the proposal was there, but the basically specific proposal on how to create will likely be submitted. I am quite skeptical about the outcome, but we will see. And then finally, I think the whole paradigm of approach to climate financing has really been shifting, and there are new emerging trends. I've seen this nice sort of concept recently in one of the presentations by HSBC Bank, so I really liked it. So it's called pre-Copenhagen, post-Copenhagen, the way this is how you call it, but you can say it's pre-crisis, post-crisis. It's pretty much same because it's coincided. Copenhagen coincided with two things. One is the crisis, and the second is elections in the United States, right? So literally a few weeks before that, there were the elections in the House and Senate, and where basically Democrats lost a lot of seats. So this kind of coincides, but it's sort of more linked to really the, I think, the crisis. So what we see is that we thought that the science, the climate science, is sufficient to really construct a deal. Well, as it turned out to be, it's not necessarily is sufficient. It now has become one of the issues, along with many others: employment, growth, technology, industrial policy, all those things. So it's somewhere buried, somewhere there. Second is, we thought that industrialist nations are going to lead. Well, in reality, what we see is actually developing countries have taken lead. Countries like China and India actually have added probably more capacity in renewable energy over the last few years than developed world. China is #1 country now in wind. China is the largest producer of PVs. And it probably also has contributed the largest share to their stimulus, which was greening of the economy. So this is one example. The ambitious India solar mission, national solar mission, or energy efficiency mission, I think it's really impressive. In solar mission, they plan to add 20 gigawatt of new solar capacity by 2022. And in the first phase, they have already successfully managed to drive costs down by about 30%. And then third one, that the carbon markets will basically be principal tool. And again, as I mentioned, I still believe, and many economists still believe, that this is the best tool, but in reality, so-called low carbon growth concept is taking over. And this is a very good concept. It is just more difficult really to have kind of level playing field to verify, and everyone has different understanding what it really means. So this is going to really shape the future of climate finance. So let me conclude. Again, climate change is real. Its impact might be catastrophic and irreversible. And the poor countries are going to suffer most. Stabilizing temperature increase to less than 2 degrees, it still remains technically and also economically feasible, but becoming more increasingly difficult to achieve. Current financing is only a fraction of what is required. There are significant commitments and voluntary commitments out there, but even if they all materialize, we will still be way above 3 degrees of Celsius. And then finally, there are financial sources out there, but it is not clear whether there is political will. So that's the end of my presentation, but I'd like to probably leave you with this quote from J.F. Kennedy. I'm pretty sure that there are these people who can dream in this room. So thank you.